A brief history of President Trump addressing mass shootings in America.
And Mika, of course, all the hopes and the prayers and all the kind words and all the well wishes, they may be helpful sometimes, but again, as we've said time and again, without real action coming from this White House, without real action coming from Moscow Mitch, who, by the way, has gun safety legislation on his desk, which he's killed. So he should really put the tombstones that we're going to show you, that in the wake of these killings, he put his political opponents in a graveyard.
Truly a Moscow Mitch.
Put tombstones there. I'm not sure whether it was in Russian or whether it was in English, the actual language. But, you know, these two people, Donald Trump and Moscow Mitch, are responsible for the killing of gun safety laws, which make America less safe. And they're gun safety laws that you and I and 90% of Americans support.
Yeah.
We're talking about expanded background checks, more universal background checks. And you saw even yesterday, the New York Post came out, Mika, and this is very telling. The New York Post came out with a front page headline. This is Rupert Murdoch's New York Post, speaking again for a majority of Americans who are saying, ban the weapons of war. And ban them now. And that's the New York Post saying that. And well over 65, 70% of Americans also agree with that. And yet Donald Trump and Moscow Mitch are the two people, only two people in Washington, D.C., killing that legislation and assuring that Donald Trump continues. A year from now, we will have to add 10 more of those speeches. And the death toll will continue to skyrocket, all because they refuse what you and your neighbors want them to do.
And these solutions are basic, and the problems are becoming much bigger than the solutions. So we're waiting too long to do even the basics here. And honestly, when you listen to the president's scripted words that his aides wrote for him, what does locking arms mean when you fan the flames of racism? What does banding together mean when you put yourself out there with your own words as a national security threat? All of this at this point with this president has to be taken into context. That this president is a racist, that this president fans the flames of hatred, and one little scripted speech means absolutely nothing in all of this. With us, we have politics editor for the Daily Beast, Sam Stein, along with Joe, Willie, and me, Republican strategist and MSNBC political analyst Susan Del Percio, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and associate editor of the Washington Post and MSNBC political analyst Eugene Robinson, and co-founder and CEO of Axios, Jim VandeHei, joins us as well.
Willie, guys, let me go to you, and let me say, and I speak only for myself here, but the President of the United States saying those words, far preferable to the President of the United States not saying those words. The President of the United States calling out white supremacy, even though he has played a large role over the past 3 or 4 years. If you even look at the statistics of white supremacy exploding in America since he got into politics. But the president calling out white supremacy is better than the president not calling out white supremacy. But as we've seen in Charlotte,
correct,
as we've seen time and time again, as we saw after the rallies where those Nazi chants were rising up through the audience in North Carolina, send her back, the president apologizes, and then he backs off of that and seems to double down. So it's really hard to say, Willie, what comes out of this latest speech that he gave yesterday.
Again, the president clearing an incredibly low bar that he condemned white supremacy.
Right.
My God, I hope he did. He said the thing that obviously he had to say. But as Mika said, the president made a speech. He read a speech off a teleprompter yesterday, completely disconnected from everything he's done and said over the last 4 years since he came down the escalator and started attacking immigrants to this country in the lobby of Trump Tower in June of 2015. Donald Trump actually said this yesterday, quote, "Now is the time to set destructive partisanship aside and find the courage to answer hatred with unity, devotion, and love." Donald Trump is lecturing America about destructive partisanship. It's a speech that if another president made it, you'd say, yeah, those are the right things to say. But you don't get to walk in for 5, 6, 8 minutes and make a speech that has nothing to do with everything else you've done and said over the time that's preceded it, and we'll see today over the time that comes after. They're just words from the president in the teleprompter.
Well, you know, Mika, they're words from the president. They have to be followed by actions. And what actions? Well, the president talked about expanded background checks. All right, call Mitch McConnell back. Moscow Mitch right now is, of course, setting up graveyards and putting names of his political opponents on tombstones in graveyards and tweeting them out right after a slaughter in El Paso and a slaughter in Ohio. Maybe if Moscow Mitch is not too busy doing that and also killing legislation that would actually protect American democracy, maybe the president, and here he is, he calls himself the Grim Reaper, and you will see he actually has,
this is what his staff
what
did.
he calls a graveyard, he actually has the name of his political opponent on a tombstone. And he tweets it out thinking that it's appropriate with, by the way, yesterday, one of Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell's followers got 20 years in prison for sending pipe bombs to political opponents. So Mitch McConnell thinks that's funny on that day, and on the day that families are getting ready to bury their loved ones that were going to back-to-school shopping. And a white supremacist attack. So maybe if Moscow Mitch is not too busy doing that, maybe Donald Trump can call him back to Washington, and we actually can have what 90% of Americans want, Mika, and that is expanded background checks, universal background checks that will make America a safer place.
Yeah, and often in situations like this, the victims get lost in it all. So let's take a moment here.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.